is not gay.
Okay, 2 Saturdays ago, June 8th, I went with a small group of street preachers to the Washington, D.C. Pride Parade. And I've compiled some footage here, some of which is my own, but a lot of it comes from my friend Jorge Pina. He's going to be the guy in the cowboy hat you'll see later on, to show you what it was like there, what we did there, and hopefully encourage other people to do the same sort of thing. So I was there with about 9 Christian street preachers, 8 men, 1 woman, and I probably should say that in the future it would really help if we had more women in this sort of event, because ironically the vast majority of people that came up to talk to us or debate with us or challenge us were women. That's not true in a lot of other venues that are kind of like this, but at the Gay Pride Parade, that was what it is. So I don't know if the presence of more women would pacify things a little bit more than what you'll see in the footage here, but it's worth a shot. So, let's check that out next time. More women at the Gay Pride Evangelism events next time. So we went out there for about 4 hours, and we would do basically 2 different things. Jorge was with one group, and he was using a handheld loudspeaker, essentially to preach to the crowd, and there was always a crowd around him. And a few others, like me, were off on the perimeter, and we held signs, and our goal was just to try to talk to people or pass out tracts. I thought that we, with our signs on the perimeter, would have more luck talking to people, but it turns out that wasn't exactly the case. A lot of people were just eager to get where they wanted to go, and Jorge, for all his, all the anger that a lot of people had against him for being there with his loudspeaker, still had plenty of people there who you could, still chat with in the midst of the noise. It is a lot of noise. It's hard to do chatting, but in the end, I got to admit, all things considered, he still did have, there was more opportunities to dialogue with folks right where he was, in the midst of all the craziness, than there was out where we were. But part of this, of course, is that, not everybody in our group was experienced in fishing for people and trying to grab them out and start conversations. And I noticed that when we left an area where everybody was walking past us and instead went to a spot where people were kind of sitting down, that helped. We got our own crowd as well. And it helped, you were there for a longer period of time, as I think if you are there for more than a couple hours, it takes some people a while to work up the nerve to come challenge you and come talk to you. Both the negative and the positive you have to be there a while before they actually start coming up to you. So if you're going to go out and do these things, and I encourage you to do that, plan to be there for like 3 or 4 hours. It got kind of intense out there. The crowd was almost entirely made up of people between the ages of 17 to 27, and there's a lot of people at these gay pride events who are not themselves homosexual or transsexual or whatever, but they were all certainly cool with practically every form of sexual licentiousness, and that's probably the uniting link between the people that show up at these things. From the moment that we showed up, there were lots of folks who surrounded us to heckle and try to just convince us to leave or drown us out with their own shouting or loud music or whatever. This is to be expected, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. We go to events like Pride because although you may not be able to minister to people on a really deep level, you find a lot of people there who are going to be very real with you, very straightforward, very upfront, because you're a stranger and they may never see you again. They're going to tell you exactly what they think and they won't hold back. And this is good because, you can you're not challenging a stereotype or a false front that they put on. You're actually challenging the person. To me, the fact that we get this reaction even when we're being fairly quiet is an indicator that this particular group of people are not really comfortable with the particular sin that they're here trying to celebrate. I don't think they're totally just at home with it, even if they can't put it into words why. So that the mere fact that we're there trying to speak the truth still resonates in their hearts. I think it's going to affect them in a positive way. So yeah, a big group of angry homosexuals and other sexual deviants, that's right where we want to be. This is not a bad decision at all, even if, in the short term, you get a lot of anger from folks. It is true that those few people who might be inclined to violence get more bold after you've been there a while. That's kind of common at these events. And that, of course, is in part because, they work up the nerve to do something nasty as time passes. And also probably has something to do with the drugs and alcohol that flow pretty freely at these things and affect people more and more as the hours pass. But there were only a couple times when we were maybe in actual danger of any sort. Somebody tried to steal our handheld cross once, and at one point a girl who'd been twerking our signs, which they like to do, she started grabbing it and kicking it and trying to damage it, but the police intervened at that and put a stop to it. And I really have to hand it to the D.C. Metropolitan Police. They did a really good job protecting us and permitting us to practice ordinary free speech without being harmed. So what are the sort of things people would say to us? The most common thing the Pride attendees would say to us is that we just needed to just go home and stop ruining everybody's fun. It was very much, I'm a victim, you guys are hateful. A lot of people called us hate speech even before we had opened our mouths, and you just need to be ashamed of yourselves and leave. It didn't seem to matter what you were doing and how you were doing it. As long as they knew you were there to challenge Pride, they were angry at you. And pretty much everybody seemed to believe that our mere presence there constitutes some sort of aggressive attack on homosexuals. I would point out that nobody on our team had ever done anything that could justify the sort of vitriol we were getting from other people, but the response I received then was that the history of Christians oppressing gay people was enough to trigger everybody out there. They just couldn't help themselves but to act in this crazy manner. Now, I don't really believe most of that. A lot of these folks, like I said, they're barely out of college, even if they're that old. And for pretty much their entire lives, America has been rather gay-affirming, There may have been folks out there who grew up in conservative or Christian households. In fact, a lot of them said that, and been in some way persecuted by their families. But I kind of doubt it was exactly as bad as they claim it was. Why do I say this? Well, when I do pro-life work, I'm often encountering people who will tell us that they just had to abort their baby. They didn't have a choice. But when you break it down, what they're dealing with, it's usually normal stuff. It's usually, breakups between couples. It's the stress that comes from a pregnancy or the stress of being a father or a mother. And that's why they choose to abort. Those are stressors, but that's not anything that ordinary people can't overcome and often do overcome all the time. So, I've kind of realized that there's a lot of folks out there who will exaggerate their own problems to make it sound as though their actions are justified, even if their actions on normal terms would be pretty ridiculous. I don't want to doubt everybody's testimony immediately, but to confirm something that might very well be an exaggeration or a bald-faced lie, that's also a really bad idea. You don't see anybody crying in this crowd. They just seem angry or mocking, Very rarely do you see somebody that would, be literally considered just sad. So, one of our signs read, "All love is not equal," and I would often try to open conversations by asking passersby if they agreed with it or not. And of course, the phrase, "not all love is equal," is in direct contradiction to the mantra that is often spoken at the Pride events and cheered and put on t-shirts and things, that all love is love. In other words, all love is equal. This essentially assumes that there's not much more to love than sexual desire. I would ask people if they love their pet dog the same way as they love their parents or their boyfriend or girlfriend, to point out that all love is in fact not equal and get the ball rolling on that. Unfortunately, the point I was trying to make was often lost on people. But I do think that as we approach homosexuals and other people whose lives are consumed with sexual sin, we need to have a good, solid apologetic as to why sex outside marriage is so wrong. What's the difference between loving your wife and loving somebody of the same sex? What's what makes one illegitimate and the other legitimate? And of course, we're talking about the act of sex itself, which these people tend to also conflate with loving someone in your heart. Certainly, God forbids sex outside marriage, and yeah, many people are conscious of that. Just that the sleeping around is not exactly healthy, but it's not as obviously wrong as punching somebody in the face is wrong. And I, for one, think that our failure to present a cohesive moral case against sexual sin is a reason that so many people have climbed on board this whole free love, homosexual bandwagon. Unlike the punch in the face, the negative effects of licentiousness are delayed, and they're just not always really apparent. I would often bring up the point with people who were talking to me that the purpose of sex is supposed to have something to do with creating families, but this also is not readily apparent to everybody. This is another failure that the church has committed. I had one girl tell me that the most sensitive pleasure points in the male body were inside the anus, and I had to reason that the reason she was saying this to me was she thought that it proved, well, this means that that's where you're supposed to stick it. Of course, her argument assumes that pleasure is the reason for sex, and I think that's a bad assumption. That pleasure is not the primary reason for sex to happen. This is something we just haven't made our case about. We were often confronted with people who wanted to challenge us with the Bible. A lot of people out there thought they knew the Bible. In fact, there were many self-professed Christians at Pride. I even met one guy who said he was an Episcopal minister of some kind. He later revealed he didn't believe in God. Well, go figure. They would rapid-fire these very unusual, quasi-biblical arguments at us. Several people asked us, well, why have you retained the Levitical taboos against homosexuality while rejecting the Levitical taboo against wearing clothing with different types of fabric? That was something people brought up a lot. But a lot of them didn't seem to realize the New Testament also condemns homosexuality. Just like with Muslims that we would meet at other venues, many people would demand chapter and verse where Jesus Christ himself mentioned and condemned homosexuality. The implication being that if Jesus didn't address it in the Gospels, it must not matter. This, of course, is nonsense, but many people seem to have drawn this conclusion. So I think in the future, we need to have certain signs that, have New Testament verses on them, speaking against sexual licentiousness of various sorts, and maybe that verse where Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. To kind of head off some of these silly comments of the past, so we don't have to address them quite as time and time again. One thing I did try to point out to people, at least those willing to listen, was that back when African Americans were, prejudiced and persecuted in the United States, African Americans had stronger families than practically anybody else. But the persecution that gay couples receive today, if in fact they receive persecution, and I'm not so sure that many of them do, it seems to have the opposite effect on the gay couples. The breakup rate among homosexual couples is extremely high. There's very few monogamous homosexuals. Gay relationships at best are usually very loose and not very chaste and not very devout. And at worst, you add persecution to that, and apparently it breaks them up even faster, which is not what happens to people who really love each other in the traditional sense. So I try to make a point that there must be something about these homosexual relationships that's forced or artificial or just not the type of love that you're looking for in a marriage. But this argument is hard to make these days because heterosexual couples are rather prone to divorce themselves. Not quite so much as homosexuals, but they're still pretty darn prone to divorce. And in fact, if that's all that people have known, if that's all they've grown up with, who can really blame them for thinking that there's no difference between a homosexual couple and a heterosexual couple? So many people were just flat out misinformed about a lot of things. At least one guy was certain that a gay gene had been identified. As far as I know, it hasn't. And somebody else told me that the reason gays moved between partners so frequently was that their partners kept getting murdered by homophobes. That's what he said. How he can maintain that, it just kind of baffles me. That many murders is rather hard to cover up. I don't know exactly the causes of death in the gay community, but I know that's not it. I believe it has something to do with AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases and drug abuse. And you can look into this yourself. I'm not sure about this one. I think the majority of gays who do get murdered are murdered by other gays. So if that's correct, that's kind of throws a monkey wrench in that whole point that he was raising. But my point is, lots of people just had all sorts of crazy alternative facts that they would raise. They don't know. They just disagree with you. They themselves hold all manner of false bits of information. And maybe this stuff needs to be addressed. Sometimes it's just a distraction, but a lot of times there are people out there who actually believe these sorts of things, and I feel we kind of have to knock them down before you can get them to listen to the truth. Again, we need to help each other make better apologetics for confronting homosexuals, so that we can get to the point of the gospel quickly, but without glossing over the reasons the gospel is necessary in the first place. Why is sex outside marriage wrong? How does it destroy you? Why does God hate it? Now, I know a number of Christians will go to Pride and they'll just ignore the problem of homosexuality, sexual licentiousness, sexual stuff altogether. They'll just preach general repentance from sin. They won't even bring up the sexual stuff. Now, personally, I think that's a mistake. At a Pride parade, you're encountering people who have almost elevated the sex act to practically the most important thing in their lives. It's what defines them. They're consciously holding on to it. And if you're going to call for repentance, you have to address that subject. I don't know how you can get around it. That's my assessment. So I think that's all I really have to say for the moment. That was our experience at DC Pride 2019. Yes, a lot of anger from people, but nevertheless, a lot of good opportunities to speak truth to folks, and some folks did listen. I hope this little video has not scared you. I can know the footage can seem kind of confrontational, but I hope that it's going to convince you that despite the confrontational nature of what you see at these events, you still need to go out there, and there's probably a lot we can learn about doing it better, and we need the help of other people getting out there and challenging this stuff, not just politically, but face-to-face with those who, might never set foot inside a Bible-believing church. I'm sure I made a lot of silly mistakes out there rhetorically, but that's partly because this is new ground. We're breaking new ground, and the fact that homosexuals have these massive parades around the country shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. Yeah, it's sad to see how many people have been deluded into this stuff, but on the other hand, these events bring all those folks together, and you can tell them the truth. So big thanks to everybody who participated to the call and helped us out at Pride 2 Saturdays ago on the 8th. Please pray for the people we met. Pray for more Christians to go out there during Pride Month, the month of June, and other homosexual events. And help us bring some light to these very dark places. I'm going to put a link to the DC for Jesus website and Facebook page in the description box, and their YouTube channel. And at the end, here's some links to Jorge Pina's raw video footage, where I got a lot of this stuff that I'm showing you here now. Please like and share this video and also Jorge's videos, and help out the work of DC for Jesus and other evangelist groups that are not afraid to go into some of the, most God-despising places on earth and tell people about love of Jesus and how they can change. Thank you very much.